had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, and the crowded streets. I picked a remote forest in northern Minnesota, somewhere deep enough that I could feel truly isolated, but not so deep that it was impossible to reach by trail. I'd done research, packed carefully, and even brought a map with multiple backup compasses. I was confident. I knew the area, I had studied local wildlife, and I'd read about the behavior of forest animals, especially wolves. Wolves were supposed to be shy, afraid of humans, unlikely to approach unless habituated. That knowledge was supposed to comfort me. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that makes your lungs feel sharp and alive. I hiked several miles, following the river upstream, keeping an eye out for tracks of deer, foxes, and even bear. By evening, I found a flat clearing near a bend in the river, perfect for my tent. I set it up quickly, making sure to secure the rain flap and stake the corners firmly. I hung my food from a tree a short distance away, careful to minimize odors, because I had read that bears and other predators sometimes came close for food. Wolves, I reminded myself, were usually afraid of humans. They avoided us. That night, the forest felt alive. The sound of the river rushing over rocks mingled with the rustle of leaves in the wind. The occasional hoot of an owl or snap of a branch kept me alert but not afraid. I cooked a small meal over my portable stove, ate quietly, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. Darkness fell like a heavy curtain, and the forest became a place of shadows and subtle noises. I told myself it was fine, I was careful, prepared, and smart. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was just the forest. Leaves brushing together, the wind shifting, maybe a deer moving near the river. But then I heard it again. A soft crunch, deliberate, like something large stepping carefully over sticks and rocks. I froze, listening. My heart began to race. Wolves were usually shy, but I knew better than to assume. I had read the reports. Habituated wolves sometimes approached humans, especially if they smelled food or if they had lost their fear. I stayed very still, barely breathing, trying to hear more. The sound was coming from the edge of the clearing, near the denser part of the forest. I could make out shapes in the darkness, shadows moving with a fluid, predatory grace. 2 sets of glowing eyes reflected my flashlight's beam from the distance. My stomach dropped. Wolves, real wild wolves watching me. My mind raced, remembering everything I had read. They usually avoided humans. Their attacks were almost always preceded by habituation. But there was no telling if these ones were bold or desperate. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe heavily. I remembered that humans' upright posture can make wolves hesitate. They often mistake us for bears, which they avoid. Slowly, I crouched low, lowering myself as much as I could, keeping my hands visible and calm. I tried to appear non-threatening while remaining alert, ready to respond if they charged. The wolves didn't approach immediately. They stayed at the tree line, circling slowly, sniffing the air. I could hear their low, cautious growls as they communicated with each other. Their fur glimmered faintly in the moonlight, gray and silver blending perfectly with the forest shadows. I could smell the faint musk of wild animals on them, the scent of raw life, untamed and wild. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but I knew that moving too fast could trigger a chase. Minutes passed like hours. The wolves inched closer, but never too close. I held my ground, slowly inching my way toward my tent, keeping low. I kept my movements deliberate, careful, knowing that one wrong step could startle them. I thought about everything I had read from David Meck and other wolf biologists. Wolves generally avoided humans, but if they had been fed before or exposed to people, their fear diminished. I had no idea if these wolves were habituated or just curious. I reached my tent finally and quietly zipped it open just enough to slip inside. I kept low, making sure my body wasn't blocking the flap in case I needed to exit quickly. From inside, I could see the wolves circling the edge of the clearing. They paused periodically, sniffing, ears twitching, watching me. My flashlight was off. I didn't want to provoke them with a sudden beam. My hands trembled slightly, and I realized how close I had come. If they had been bolder or if I had moved too quickly, it might have ended very differently. I stayed there for nearly an hour, listening to the subtle movements of the wolves, until the first light of dawn started to spill into the trees. As the sun rose, their behavior changed. Wolves usually avoid humans during daylight. They rely on stealth and their prey's vulnerability. One by one, they retreated into the denser parts of the forest, their silhouettes fading into the shadows. My relief was overwhelming. I didn't move until I was certain they were gone. By morning, the forest seemed peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. I emerged from my tent slowly, scanning the area. There were paw prints in the dirt and flattened grass from where they had circled the clearing, evidence of their presence that made the night feel even more real. I realized just how lucky I had been. These weren't aggressive attacks. These were wolves testing boundaries, curious and cautious, and I had survived by staying calm and respecting their space. I packed up my camp quickly, every movement deliberate. My mind was buzzing with adrenaline and relief. I kept looking over my shoulder as I walked back along the trail, aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. The forest that had felt peaceful the day before now held an edge of danger that I couldn't ignore. But it also held beauty, wild, untamed, and magnificent. I understood why people respected wolves so deeply. They were intelligent, cautious, and powerful, and living among them required humility and vigilance. When I finally reached my car, I sat for a long time, breathing heavily, trying to let the tension drain. I realized that fear can sharpen your senses, can make every step deliberate, and can make you more aware of the natural world than anything else can. That night taught me respect. Respect for wildlife, for the unpredictability of nature, and for the fact that even shy animals can become bold under certain circumstances. I had been careful, calm, and deliberate, and it had saved me. That experience stayed with me for years. Every time I think about wolves in the wild, I remember the circling eyes in the dark, the soft patting of their paws on the forest floor, the cautious growls, and the way they measured me. It wasn't a story about monsters or supernatural danger. It was real, grounded, and terrifying because it was nature itself asserting its presence. And the lesson was clear. Fear is natural, preparation is essential, and respecting the wild can keep you alive even when you are face to face with predators. I was maybe 13 at the time, and my friends and I were on a summer camp that lasted a whole week. We were staying in platform tents, the kind built on raised wooden decks with canvas stretched over wooden frames. They were supposed to keep you safe from the damp ground and any small critters, but no tent can keep you completely insulated from the forest around it. I had been excited to sleep there, imagining the nights under the trees with stars peeking through the canvas roof. What I didn't expect was to wake up in the middle of the forest, barefoot, in the pitch-black dark, completely alone. I remember the night clearly. It had been a normal day of hiking, games, and meals that were surprisingly decent for camp food. By the time lights out came, I was exhausted. I had crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the sounds of the other kids tossing and turning, whispering, and giggling quietly in their own tents. Sleep came fast. I must have been really tired because the next thing I knew, I wasn't in my tent anymore. I woke up standing. That's the first detail I remember. The weird sense of verticality, my knees locked, my arms hanging at my sides, my toes pressed into the cool, damp earth, and I felt the softness of moss and leaves underfoot. For a moment, I didn't even realize I was awake. Then the panic hit. My eyes opened fully, adjusting slowly to the darkness. The forest was around me, tall trees rising like shadowy sentinels, branches whispering with the wind. I was barefoot, my pajama shorts torn slightly from the tent zippers, my heart hammering in my chest. I froze, breathing shallow and fast, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How did I get here? I could see the outlines of other tents in the distance, barely visible through the blackness, but nothing else. I remembered the safe deck of my platform tent, the warm sleeping bag, the soft hum of my friend's breathing. That memory clashed violently with the reality of standing alone in the forest. Panic started creeping in. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Even if someone heard me, it wasn't like anyone could get to me instantly in the dark. I started walking carefully, slowly, trying not to trip over roots or moss-covered rocks. The forest floor was uneven, and every step I took reminded me how unprepared I was. My toes throbbed from the cold and from the sting of small twigs and pebbles. I realized I had been sleepwalking. That thought alone made the hairs on my arms stand up. The realization was terrifying. I hadn't been aware of moving, and yet here I was, far enough from my tent that I had no idea how long I'd been walking. As I wandered, my eyes began picking out shapes in the dark. Branches, fallen logs, the faint outline of a trail we'd walked earlier in the day. My mind was racing. I tried to remember landmarks, anything that could help me find my way back. The problem was, the forest at night looked completely different than during the day. Trees that had seemed small now towered over me, shadows twisting into shapes that made me flinch. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of a leaf in the wind made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something I didn't want to see, though I knew logically it was just the forest being the forest. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance. I couldn't tell what it was at first. It flickered slightly, like a lantern or a flashlight. My pulse quickened. Was it one of the camp leaders coming to check on me? Was it another kid sleepwalking like I had been? My imagination raced, and part of me was terrified of moving toward it. But another part of me, the rational part, knew I had to get back to the tent, to safety. I started moving toward the light, careful not to make too much noise or trip over anything. The light got a little clearer as I approached. It was definitely artificial, probably a lantern hung near the campfire area or someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded me, but it was mixed with a lingering fear that I couldn't shake. I still didn't know how far I'd wandered. The forest seemed endless in the night, and the darkness felt thick, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled over a root, catching myself against the rough bark of a tree, and the sharp pain in my palm reminded me how vulnerable I had been. Finally, I made it to the edge of the clearing where the platform tents were lined up. I could see shadows of my friends' tents, the familiar shapes now comforting rather than imposing. My bare feet were cold and raw, my pajamas damp from dew and grass. I collapsed on the ground for a moment, just breathing, letting the relief wash over me. I had survived, and nothing had harmed me. But the terror of waking up alone in the dark forest lingered like a shadow behind my eyes. I crawled back into my tent, grateful for the canvas walls and the raised wooden deck. The sleeping bag felt warmer than ever, wrapping me in comfort and safety. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the tent, thinking about how easily I could have gotten lost, how quickly panic had taken over, and how vulnerable I had been while completely unconscious. I thought about the flickering light I'd seen and allowed myself a small, shaky laugh. At the time, in my sleep-addled panic, my mind had briefly considered aliens. Who knows, in that state, anything could have seemed possible. But rationally, it was just the forest, the darkness, and my own sleepwalking. The next morning, I told the leaders what had happened. They were concerned but unsurprised. Sleepwalking isn't uncommon in kids around that age, especially after long days filled with activity and excitement. We all agreed it had been dangerous, but luckily, I hadn't wandered far enough to get seriously hurt. They made a note to make sure all the kids' tents had better lighting and that someone was keeping an eye out for anyone sleepwalking in the future. I felt embarrassed at first, but also oddly proud. I had survived something terrifying, something that could have gone much worse, and lived to tell the tale. Looking back now, it's clear what had happened. I had sleepwalked, lost my bearings in the dark, and been terrified by the forest itself. There were no aliens, no monsters, nothing supernatural, just the very real fear of being alone in the dark. And that fear was enough to make the night feel eternal, to make my heart pound until I thought it would explode, to make every sound, every shadow, every faint flicker of light a threat. That night changed the way I saw the forest and the way I approached camping. I learned to respect the darkness, to always be aware of my surroundings, and to recognize how quickly a safe, familiar place can feel entirely alien when you're alone and disoriented. It also gave me a story I would remember forever, A night when I walked through the forest barefoot, lost in my own unconscious wandering, terrified, and yet ultimately safe. Even now, when I walk in the woods at night, I think about that moment. I remember the cold, the quiet, the absolute isolation of the forest. And I remember the relief of finally seeing that light, knowing I was going to be okay. That experience didn't just scare me. It taught me to respect nature, to respect my own vulnerability, and to never underestimate the power of being alone in the dark, even in a place that seemed completely safe. I was around 14 or 15 when this happened, still at that age where I thought nothing bad could ever really happen to me as long as I was with a friend and holding a flashlight. My family used to camp at the same state park every summer. It wasn't anything special, just a mix of pine woods, dirt trails, an old lake, and a campground that always smelled like smoke and bug spray. But back then it felt like the whole world. Every night after dinner, after the adults got lost in their own conversations, my friend and I would leave the campground and disappear into the trees. We called it the ritual. It made us feel older than we were, like we had some private adventure that only we understood. We didn't do anything exciting. Mostly we'd walk, kicking through dry leaves, shining our small flashlights up at the branches, trying to see if we could find owls or raccoons. Some nights we'd turn off the flashlights and try to move through the dark without tripping. It made us feel brave. The woods were different with the lights off. Every sound became sharp. Every shadow looked thicker. But we kept doing it night after night until it felt normal. Most nights we stayed close to the campground, maybe a 5-minute walk in. We could still see the glow of campfires through the trees, and the distant hum of people talking made the woods feel safer. But that night we decided to go deeper. I don't know why. Maybe we were bored. Maybe we were trying to prove something to ourselves. The woods felt extra quiet that night, and the air had that cold bite that settles in after the sun drops. The kind of air that makes you hear your own breathing. We walked farther than we ever had before. The trees grew taller and the ground got more uneven, filled with roots and little dips that made us watch where we stepped. We were far enough in that the campground noise had completely disappeared. No more fire crackling, no laughter from other campsites, no clanking of pots or someone dragging a folding chair. It was just the woods and our footsteps. Eventually, like we usually did, we turned off our flashlights to see how long we could last. When the darkness closed around us, it felt thicker than usual, almost like it pressed on my shoulders. I remember blinking a few times just to adjust, but the woods were pitch black. The only light came from the faint outline of the sky through the branches. We walked slow, feeling for the ground before each step. I kept one hand out in front of me, just in case. We were maybe half a mile from the nearest campsite when I heard it. Soft whispering, not words I could understand, not even loud enough to guess the tone. Just a faint, breathy noise behind us, like someone trying to speak but holding their voice back. At first I told myself it was wind through the trees, or maybe a deer moving through leaves. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like something trying to form words. My chest tightened and all the small hairs on my arms stood up. Instinct kicked in. I switched on my flashlight and spun around so fast I almost slipped on a root. My friend did the same. Our lights cut through the darkness, slicing between the trees, hitting trunks, ferns, and uneven ground. But nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. I told myself I probably imagined it. The woods could play tricks on you when you took away your sight. We kept walking a little faster this time, and the idea of turning the flashlights off again was gone. Neither of us said it, but we both felt it. Then we heard it again. This time it was slightly louder, still soft, still whisper-like, but clearer. We stopped dead in our tracks. I felt frozen in place, every part of me alert. I scanned the darkness behind us with my light, slower this time, making sure I covered every inch. My friend did the same. I didn't see anything, but I had that heavy feeling you get when someone is watching you. That pressure in the back of your neck that makes you want to turn around over and over again. We finally decided to head back. The woods didn't feel fun anymore. They didn't even feel like the same woods we had walked through 100 times. They felt tight and wrong, like something cold had started moving between the trees. As we turned to leave, something caught my eye. A shape on the ground maybe 20 yards away. At first I thought it was an animal because it was low and hunched. But the longer I stared, the more it looked like a person. My chest felt like it dropped into my stomach. It was a woman, crawling. She was moving slowly, dragging herself across the ground, her clothes dark and covered in dirt. I couldn't see her face at first, just the outline of her body and the way her arms pulled her forward. The whispering sound was coming from her, but it didn't sound like words. It sounded like thoughts leaking out of someone who wasn't fully aware of what they were doing. I felt frozen. My brain couldn't make sense of the image in front of me. Nothing in the woods should crawl toward two teenagers in the dark. Nothing should whisper like that. For a moment, I thought maybe she was hurt, or maybe she was dangerous, or maybe both. Then she lifted her head. Her face was smeared with dirt, streaked across her cheeks and forehead. Her hair looked tangled like she had been rolling on the ground. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, like she was trying to find something but couldn't lock onto anything. Standing there in the woods with my flashlight beam shaking over her face, I felt more scared than I ever had in my life. Something about the way she moved didn't seem right. Something about the way she stared made the whole forest feel wrong. She slowly pushed herself to her feet. I could see her legs wobbling like she had been crawling a long time. She kept whispering, but it still didn't make sense. It was just broken sounds. She looked like someone who had been wandering the woods for hours without knowing where she was. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't angry, but there was something deeply unsettling about the whole moment. Seeing someone like that, alone, dirty, crawling toward us in the dark woods, whispering to herself, it felt like a scene from a nightmare, but it was real. We ended up guiding her back toward the campground. She couldn't walk straight, and she moved like every step confused her. The whole way back I kept looking around, checking the trees, checking the shadows, half expecting something else to appear. But it was just us, the woman, and the dark. As we got closer to the lights of the campground, the woods slowly started feeling normal again. The trees didn't seem as tight. The air didn't feel as heavy. The whispering stopped. She walked a bit steadier, like the sight of nearby campsites gave her something to focus on. When we reached the campground area, we tried to help her find her group. Took a while. Most of the campsites were quiet, and people were already inside their tents or around dim fire pits. We kept walking with her until we finally found a group of people who recognized her. They hadn't even noticed she was missing. She had just tried to find a bathroom and wandered into the woods in the wrong direction. She was extremely drunk, maybe high too, and had ended up deeper in the forest than she realized. The relief I felt when her group came over to get her was something I can still remember in my chest. She wasn't dangerous. She wasn't some creature or anything like that. She was just a person who got lost in a place that becomes terrifying the moment you lose control of your surroundings. That night changed how I looked at the woods. Before that, they were just a dark place we walked through for fun. After that, I understood how quickly things could go wrong. How easy it is to get turned around, to panic, to lose your sense of direction. And how sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't animals or shadows or strange noises. Sometimes it's just another human being who wandered too far and lost themselves in the dark. Looking back now, I realize how lucky she was. If we hadn't walked that far into the woods that night, she would have stayed there crawling and whispering for who knows how long. The temperature dropped that night. She wasn't dressed for the cold. She wasn't thinking clearly. She could have ended up miles away from any trail, deeper and deeper into the forest, until morning came and nobody knew where to even start looking. The thing that still sits with me is how quiet everything was before we heard her. No crunching leaves, no branches breaking, no breathing, just that soft whispering out of nowhere in the middle of a huge dark forest. Sometimes I think about how long she had been out there, how many times she might have crawled close to a trail, whispering to herself, hoping someone would hear her. Even now, years later, whenever I camp, I never walk the woods in the dark without a light on. The darkness isn't a game anymore. That night taught me that you never really know who else might be out there, stumbling around, lost, scared, whispering things you can't quite understand until your flashlight finally lands on them. And sometimes the fear you feel doesn't come from danger. It comes from the realization that the only thing separating safety and disaster is a few wrong steps in the dark. I used to run a Cub Scout pack years ago, and one weekend we went camping at a Scout Association campsite on the outskirts of southeast London. The site was the typical mix of grass, patches of dirt, and a few scattered trees along the edges. The tents were lined up in neat rows, each holding 4 boys. There was always a low murmur of noise during the day, boys running around, laughing, tripping over each other, and leaders trying to keep everything under control. But once night fell, everything changed. The campsite would quiet down. The only sounds were distant dogs barking in the suburbs, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional wind shaking the tent fabric. That particular Saturday night, I had gone to bed later than usual. My sleeping bag was rolled out at the edge of the row, closest to the boys' tents so I could hear anything unusual. Around 2 a.m., I woke abruptly, heart racing, because I heard the most terrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't just loud. It was filled with pure terror, the kind that makes your stomach flip and your blood run cold. I didn't even think for a second about what it might be. My instincts just threw me upright. I jumped out of my sleeping bag, my bare feet hitting the cold grass. The night was dark, but the sky was clear enough to make out the faint shapes of the trees and tents. I ran toward the boys' row, adrenaline pumping so hard I barely noticed the cold or the dirt underfoot. The scream cut off as suddenly as it had started. Just gone. Silence fell immediately, a silence so thick it pressed against my ears. When I reached the tents, my heart was hammering in my chest. I expected to see something horrifying. A boy being dragged away, some creature I couldn't even imagine. But there was nothing. All the tents were still. No signs of struggle. No noise. Just the quiet rustling of fabric as the tents swayed in the gentle wind. The other 2 leaders, who must have been woken by the scream as well, appeared beside me a moment later, their faces pale and eyes wide. They had been sleeping a few tents down and, just like me, had rushed over expecting disaster. We scanned the area frantically, shining flashlights over every tent, checking for anything amiss. But the boys were all there, bundled in their sleeping bags, breathing steadily, as if nothing had happened. Couldn't believe it. I counted them, every boy was accounted for. I circled the row again, checking every zipper and tent flap. Everything was intact. The tent fabric bore no signs of someone forcing it open. No tears, no dirt on the outside that suggested someone had crawled in or out in a panic. I even lifted the flaps to look inside, and all the boys were there, eyes closed, undisturbed. I tried to see if anyone had sleepwalked or had gotten out and returned quietly, but there were no footprints, no marks in the grass, nothing. It was impossible. I remember standing there, flashlight trembling in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The scream had been so human, so real. It had said, "Mummy," among other words, right before it stopped. That confirmed it. It was a boy, and he had been terrified. But how could it happen like that without anyone else noticing? How could one boy scream at the top of his lungs and not wake up 3 other boys in the same tent? Not one. We stayed up for the rest of the night, pacing around the tents, shining flashlights over the sleeping boys, listening for the slightest noise. We checked all the surrounding areas, the toilets, the fire pit, the little wooded patches, but there was nothing. No stray animals, no signs of anyone approaching the tents, nothing out of the ordinary. The rest of the night passed in a tense, jittery silence. None of the boys woke up again. None of them mentioned anything in the morning, and the boy who had screamed never explained what had scared him. In the daylight, I could see the campsite more clearly. The tents were in perfect rows, the grass flattened slightly where people had walked, the dirt trails from the day before. Everything seemed normal, almost absurdly normal after the terror of the night. I walked past the boys, checking that they were all okay. They were asleep, oblivious to the nightmare their screaming had caused. I couldn't shake the image of the pitch-black night, and that scream, though, felt so unreal. I later asked the other leaders what they thought. They were as mystified as I was. One suggested it might have been a nightmare that had been so intense the boy screamed as if it were real, and his voice carried farther than we expected. But even that didn't make sense. I'd been closer than any adult could reasonably be to a boy in a tent without noticing him moving around, and still nothing seemed disturbed. The idea of it being a nightmare didn't fit with the terror in the voice. The way it had sounded human and immediate, raw and desperate. Years later, I still think about that night. I replay it in my mind. The sudden scream, the adrenaline, the way we ran in the darkness, expecting something monstrous, and then the silence. I consider every possibility, from the boy's imagination to some unusual sleep behavior, but nothing explains it entirely. It left a permanent mark on me as a leader. It was a reminder that, even in familiar and safe places, the unknown is never far away, and you can't predict how a moment can change everything. The most important thing, in the end, was that nothing bad actually happened. All the boys were safe, accounted for, and unharmed. We finished the weekend as planned. The boy never screamed like that again, and life went back to normal. But the memory stayed. I learned that being a leader isn't just about teaching skills or guiding activities. Sometimes it's about being ready for the unexplainable, staying calm when the impossible happens, and protecting the kids through it. That night at the campsite remains the single scariest experience I've ever had. Not because of monsters or danger in the traditional sense, but because it was real, sudden, and completely inexplicable. It was just a boy screaming in the night, but the fear it induced was undeniable. And the lesson was clear. Always stay vigilant. Always respect the unpredictability of the world around you. And know that sometimes, even when you see nothing, something extraordinary is happening, right in front of you. We packed up, left the campsite, and I never forgot it. The screams, the silence, and the realization that human fear can be as terrifying as any tangible threat stayed with me for the rest of my life. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks. I wanted to escape the city, the constant noise, and just be alone in the mountains. I picked a spot high up on a ridge that overlooked a wide valley, where I could see the forest stretch for miles and the peaks rising beyond. The sun was starting to dip below the mountains when I finally found the clearing that would be my home for the night. It was perfect, flat enough for my tent, with a little fire pit already made, and surrounded by scattered rocks and small trees that could give a sense of seclusion. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get it done before it got completely dark. The air was crisp, the kind that makes your lungs feel alive. I noticed some goat tracks in the dirt, but I didn't think much of it. Mountain goats were common in this area, and they usually kept their distance from humans. I brushed my worries aside, lighting my small camp stove to make a quick meal. The wind carried the smell of my food down the slope, and I figured that was the last of any wildlife I'd see up close. Night fell faster than I expected. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the stars were shining brightly overhead, and a cool breeze was rustling the leaves. I was tired from the hike, and the warmth of the bag and the quietness of the mountain were lulling me towards sleep. That's when I first noticed the sound. A scraping, soft but deliberate, like something heavy was being dragged over rock. My heart picked up, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a small animal or the wind moving branches against the ground. Then came the sound of hooves on dirt. Heavy, solid thuds that echoed unnaturally close. My stomach dropped. I knew then that this was no small animal. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, listening. The thuds grew closer, circling the tent. I could hear snorts, low and gruff, almost like the goats were sniffing the air around me. And then I realized the worst. I was surrounded. I could see the faint outlines of their silhouettes through the thin nylon of the tent. At least 5, maybe 6 goats pressing against the sides, testing it with their horns and noses. My first instinct was to panic, to bolt, but I quickly realized that moving could provoke them. Mountain goats are strong and stubborn, and if they thought I was food or a threat, they could easily crush me against the tent walls with sheer force. I forced myself to stay calm. My mind raced. I had read that wildlife sometimes backs off if they don't perceive a threat, so I decided to try something I never thought I'd have to do. I would pretend to be an object. I froze, lying flat on my sleeping bag, trying to make myself as small and non-threatening as possible. Every time a goat nudged the tent with its nose, I stayed completely still, forcing my muscles not to twitch, my breath shallow and controlled. The goats were relentless. One ram pressed hard with its head, shaking the tent, making the poles creak. I felt the vibrations through my body and could hear the scrape of its hooves against the canvas. Another tried to squeeze in from the side, testing the zipper area. My stomach tightened so hard it felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself over and over, "Don't move, don't breathe too loud, don't panic." If I stayed just like this, maybe they'd lose interest. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I could feel sweat running down my back, soaking my sleeping bag, and my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. Their noses brushed the tent with wet, rough touches, sniffing and pushing, trying to figure out what this strange, soft lump was. I imagined them judging me as some unimportant object, maybe a fallen log or a strange rock they had never seen before. At one point, I felt a goat's horn nudge the tent's roof, and I stifled a gasp. The tent shuddered violently, and for a split second, I thought the pole would snap. I could hear it bending under the pressure. My entire body tensed, ready for pain, ready to run, but I forced myself to stay still. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the nudging eased, but the circling didn't stop. I could hear them moving around, their hooves crunching on rocks and dirt, sniffing, always sniffing. The night air was cold, and the smell of their coats was sharp, musky, and unmistakable. I could feel the heat of their bodies pressing against the thin fabric of the tent from all sides. Every instinct in my body screamed, to bolt, to run, but I didn't. I knew that any sudden movement could trigger a charge. Hours must have passed. The goats gradually became less aggressive. They pressed against the tent less often, stepping back a little at a time. I didn't move, didn't even breathe heavily, just stayed like a lump of nothingness. I remember thinking that this might be how it ended. Trapped in a canvas prison surrounded by wild goats, completely helpless. But somehow, staying still worked. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, the goats had finally moved away. I could hear them stepping down the slope, their soft snorts fading into the distance. I waited a long time before I even dared to peek out. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped a corner of the tent and looked out. The clearing was empty. The tracks in the dirt were everywhere, showing where they had pressed, nudged, and circled my tent through the night. I could see broken branches where their horns had knocked against small trees, and small dents in the ground from their weight. I climbed out of the tent, my legs trembling, and surveyed the damage. My sleeping bag was damp and dirt-stained. My gear scattered slightly from the shaking of the tent, but I was alive. Every muscle in my body ached from tension, from holding myself still for what felt like an eternity. I sat down on a rock, letting the adrenaline drain slowly. I felt relief, but also awe at how close I had come to real danger. These animals were powerful, unafraid, and utterly indifferent to my presence. I packed my gear carefully, not wanting to risk another encounter. The forest around me was quiet now, the morning sun casting long shadows across the mountains. I took one last look at the clearing where I had spent the night, my hands still shaking. I realized I had underestimated the mountains, underestimated the wildness that lived there. It wasn't a ghost or a monster that had terrified me. It was real life, pure and raw, the sheer strength of nature pressing against the fragile walls of a human tent. When I finally descended the ridge, I felt changed. I felt a mix of respect, fear, and gratitude. The mountains had tested me, and I had survived, but only because I had controlled my instincts, stayed calm, and respected the force around me. I knew that camping would never feel the same again. That night had reminded me that being alone in the wilderness is not a casual adventure. It's a negotiation with forces far stronger than yourself. By the time I reached my car, the sun was fully up, warming my back. I sat for a long while in the driver's seat, breathing deeply, letting the tension drain. I knew I would tell the story over and over in my head, never out loud, about the night the mountain goats had surrounded me, about how stillness had saved me, and about the raw, unforgiving power of nature. That experience left me with a deep respect for wildlife, for mountains, and for the thin line between safety and danger when you step into the wild alone. I had survived, and somehow that made the mountains feel even bigger, even wilder, and even more alive than they ever had before.